If you hear a loud noise behind you, or a growl when you're in the forest, the first thing that happens is you don't know what's going on. And that's the initial state of contact with potential. And then if you turn around and you look, that potential manifests itself into something that's predatory. And you have a circuit for that. And that's the same circuit that we now use to assess anything unexpected that occurs to us. And that circuit had to come from somewhere. And so our capacity to respond to surprising entities is an elaboration up into abstraction of our capacity to identify predators. So that's the next level of reality. And out of that chaotic circumstance comes something that's more human. And that is the emergence of masculinity and femininity out of that more primordial element. This is a map of pragmatic territory, as far as I can tell. It's the territory that people actually inhabit. At the first level, it's the square. I called that the dragon of chaos. That's the unknown as such. And it's the thing that you fall into when your conceptual schemes fall apart. What manifests itself out of that is femininity. And femininity comes in two forms. One is benevolent femininity. Example would be this. You see Mary on the left there. She's in a structure called a mandorla, which is, from a Freudian perspective, has obvious sexual connotations. You see, if you look carefully, that she's standing on a reptile and holding her child away from it. It's a common medieval Christian image. And you can think of it as divine because women spent an awful lot of time doing that with their children over the course of our millions of years of evolution. And it's something that's sacred because our species depended on that for its survival. This one's even better. This is a medieval image. I love this image. So there's Mary with the Christ child, and she's standing again on a reptile, a predatory reptile. But in the background, you see all those weird little shapes? Those are musical instruments. And they fill space. And the medieval artist who drew this picture had this intimation that behind the manifestation of something as primary as the protective maternality of Mary was something like the music of the spheres, or a collection of harmonious patterns, and that this figure was constantly emerging out of that background of harmonious patterns across the infinite stretches of time itself. It's a sacred image because it represents something that human society cannot live without. It's like any society that doesn't regard the virgin and the child, who protects the child from the predatory serpent as a prime element of sacred reality, is going to make itself extinct. You know, I could say, for example, that that's what's happening to the indigenous populations of Eastern Europe at the moment, where their birth rate is far below replacement. I'm going to show you another image. This is called a vierge ouvrante, or an open virgin. And it was a common representation in medieval Europe. And it's a weird representation from a Christian perspective because it kind of reverses the normal hierarchy of power. What you have here is Mary. She's holding the Christ child when the statue is closed. And then you open her up. And what you see inside Mary is God, the Father. And God the Father is holding Christ in his hands. Now, Mary constitutes the superordinate, benevolent feminine. And inside her is the structure of culture. So you can think, inside nature is the structure of culture. And that's represented in this image by God, because he's the ultimate father, obviously, in Christian thinking. And then the God figure is holding what? Crucified individual. What does that mean? Now, all the people around there, kings, queens, commoners, are all gazing at that central figure, which of course is fundamentally what everyone in Western civilization has been doing for 2,000 years, not knowing why. Nature gives rise to culture. Culture gives rise to the suffering individual. Well, that's true enough. It's true for everyone. It's true for life at every point in time. But there's more to the image of the crucifixion, because the crucifixion also represents voluntary acceptance of suffering and voluntary acceptance of death. And it also points to something else that's of paramount importance, which is that there's an element of the human psyche that can die and come back, and die and come back. And that's what happens to you when you encounter a catastrophe and you make order of it and you climb back out of the underworld. And your voyage through life is punctuated by trips to the underworld. And so you're somewhere, and then you go outside that, and then you go somewhere else, and then you go outside that. And so what happens to people is they generally identify with where they are. Order. But order dissolves and collapses, and then it reconstitutes itself. So then you might say, if you were trying to adapt to the structure of reality itself, instead of identifying with order, you would identify with a process that allowed you to transform yourself across repeated bouts of order and chaos. And that's what these sorts of images are trying to represent. So, let me show you one final idea. There's a Taoist idea that's like this. So the Taoist symbol, you know the Taoist symbol, I already talked to you about it and you've all seen it. Chaos and order, masculine and feminine, constantly in interplay. That's Tao from the Taoist perspective, and Tao is the source of meaning. So the idea there is that it's the constant interplay between chaos and order that produces the sense of meaning in human beings. And that's true. That is what produces the sense of meaning. You know that because when you're engaged in a compelling operation, you're partly ordered and secure, and you have one foot out into the unknown, and the balance is proper. And as a consequence, you're engaged in what you're doing, and as a consequence of that, you lose your self-consciousness. And if you stay engaged in that sort of situation on a continual basis, then you find that your life is meaningful and rich, and that's the best antidote to the fact that life is bounded and full of suffering. Now, Tao means meaning. It also means journey. And the center of the Tao is the place you're supposed to be. One foot in chaos and one foot in order. And that's the best place to be in the actual environment itself. Because the actual environment is better construed as the constant interplay between chaos and order than it is construed as a collection of material objects. Modern people don't believe that meaning exists. They think it's epiphenomenal. There's nothing subjective about our worldview. When in fact our nervous systems are tuned so that life is manifesting itself in the most meaningful possible way when you happen to be occupying the precise position between chaos and order that maximizes your security and the development of that security across time. And that's the most real thing there is. And to stay in that position is also to accept voluntarily the necessity for a certain degree of suffering, because as you extend your capacities by exposing yourself to the optimal level of the unknown, you're constantly taking yourself apart and rebuilding yourself. And that's what allows you to thrive not only in the presence of stability, but also in a state that consists of the transformation of that stability. When you pay attention, you absorb information. When you absorb information, you continually transform yourself, and that keeps you on top of an ever-shifting reality. Doing that is meaningful, and that's what stops you from becoming bitter and cruel. Because, life is suffering, and if you don't have an antidote to that suffering that's real, then you become resentful about the structure of experience, and then you'll do everything you can to take revenge on it. And we saw what happened when people did that in the 20th century. And it would be a good thing if people woke up and stopped doing it. And as far as I can tell, after trying to figure this out for like 30 years, the way that you do that is by paying attention and transforming yourself when it's necessary and stopping the process of identifying with what you already believe. Who the hell cares what you believe? You should be attending to the things you don't know, which is a much larger space than the things you know. And then you should be construing yourself not as the inhabitant of a sterile and static and already completed structure, but as the thing that lives on the edge of that, that's constantly building and rebuilding it. And then if something happens to your structure, it's not so relevant because that's not what you are. You're the thing that can engage in transformations of structure. What should constitute the transcendent value that sits above all other values is your capacity to voluntarily accept the restricted and painful conditions of your life, to face them, and as a consequence of facing them, immediately transcend them. Now, one of the things we know from clinical psychology is that if you have someone who's afraid, they avoid. So what do you do about that? You break down the thing they're afraid of till you find a small unit that they can approach. When they approach it, they learn that they can approach it and that they're more than they thought they were. And then they can approach the next thing.